Dawn breaks over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, 07:02 hours, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The carrier, USS Yorktown, pitches gently in swells, stained gold by first light. On her flight deck, aviation ordnancemen crouch beside dauntless dive bombers, wrenching bomb shackles tight, fingers slick with hydraulic fluid and salt spray. The air tastes of aviation, gasoline and fear. Radio static crackles through headsets as scout planes report coordinates that will alter the course of the warfare. Japanese carriers steaming in tight formation, decks packed with aircraft, their rising sun insignias vivid against grey steel. Within hours, 3 of those carriers will become funeral pyres. But the cost America pays is staggering. By day's end, Yorktown lies mortally wounded, listing 17 degrees, her compartments flooding. She will sink 2 days later, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, while under tow. U.S. Navy action report. Battle of Midway, June 1942. She joins Lexington, lost at Coral Sea just weeks prior. Her aviation fuel lines ruptured by internal explosions that turned her into an inferno. U.S. Naval War College Historical Monograph, 1947. Before 1942 ends, Wasp will burn off Guadalcanal. Aviation, gasoline igniting in cascading blasts that force her crew to abandon ship. And Hornet Doolittle's launch platform, the carrier that brought the war to Tokyo's doorstep, will absorb bomb after bomb, torpedo after torpedo, refusing to die until Japanese destroyers finish her with long-lance torpedoes in the cold darkness of the Santa Cruz Islands. Commander-in-Chief. Pacific Fleet War Diary, October 1942. 4 fleet carriers, America's backbone in the Pacific, gone in 5 months. Standing in the map room of the White House in late October 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt traces the reports with fingers that tremble slightly, despite his practiced composure. The Imperial Japanese Navy has sunk or crippled every modern American carrier in the Pacific, except Enterprise, and Saratogan Enterprise herself limps toward Pearl Harbor, trailing an oil slick from bomb damage sustained at Eastern Solomons, her flight deck cratered, her forward elevator jammed at an angle. Bureau of Ships Damage Report. August 1942. Across the National Mall, in the labyrinthine corridors of the Navy Department's main building on Constitution Avenue, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, a man whose severity makes granite seem warm, convenes his staff with a single question that hangs in the tobacco-thick air like an ultimatum. How does the United States Navy project power across 7,000 miles of hostile ocean when it no longer possesses the carriers to do so? The strategic mathematics are brutal. Japan enters 1942 with 10 fleet and light carriers. America begins the year with 7 in the Pacific Fleet. By November, count stands at Japan's advantage. 6 operational carriers against America's 2 battered survivors. Yamamoto's carrier striking force, the Kito Butai, proved at Pearl Harbor, and across the South Pacific, that carrier aviation determines naval supremacy in this new kind of war where battleships are floating coffins, and the side that strikes first from the air wins. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. The Campaigns of the Pacific War, 1946. Every island America must seize to reach Tokyo. Rawa, Kwailine, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa requires carrier air cover. Every supply convoy threading through submarine-infested waters needs carrier fighter protection. Without carriers, the Pacific offensive dies in the water. Yet in the dockyards and fabrication halls of the United States, something unprecedented is already taking shape. At Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and at the sprawling Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, welders in leather aprons ignite acetylene torches that burn white-hot against massive steel plates. The shriek of riveting guns echoes across the waterfronts, 16 hours a day, as shifts overlap. As women in coveralls, Rosie the riveters, immortalized in propaganda, but whose hands truly build the Armada, climb scaffolding to position armor belts 9 inches thick. Newport News Shipbuilding Company, production records, 1942 to 1945. These are not the pre-war fleet carriers. Those elegant but vulnerable ships, designed in the 1930s with unarmored aviation fuel systems and inadequate damage control. These are Essex-Class carriers, 27,000 tons of welded steel and vengeance, conceived before Pearl Harbor, but now accelerated into existence with a ferocity that defies industrial logic. The Essex-Class design emerges from the drafting tables of the Bureau of Ships in 1940, when war still seems distant but inevitable. Naval architects, led by Captain later Rear Admiral A.H. Van Coyeren, refine lessons from earlier carriers. Longer flight decks to handle heavier aircraft, armored magazines and fuel tanks, redundant fire mains, decentralized damage control, and a deck-edge elevator that won't trap the entire air group below if damaged. Bureau of Ships Design History, CV-29 Class, 1946. The keel of CV-9, the lead ship christened USS Essex, is laid at Newport News on April 28, 1941, 7 months before. Pearl Harbor. Newport News shipbuilding key-laying ceremony records, April 1941, but on December 7, when Japanese bombs shattered Battleship Row, the Essex is barely 30% complete, her skeletal frame exposed to Virginia rain. The Navy Department issues Emergency Order 1142 on December 15, 1941, authorizing unlimited overtime, material priority status, and cost-plus contracting to accelerate construction. What was projected as a 30-month build schedule compresses to 18 months. Impossible, the shipwrights mutter until it isn't. By midnight, as Yorktown's survivors wash ashore on Pacific atolls and Hornet's wreckage settles onto abyssal plains, 9 Essex-class carriers are under simultaneous construction. Overhead cranes swing 100-ton hull sections into place. Electric arc welders' fuse seams that must hold against typhoon seas and kamikaze impacts. In Schenectady, General Electric's turbine works machines, reduction gears, the size of houses, each gear tooth hand-polished to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, components for propulsion systems that will drive these ships at 33 knots, faster than any Japanese carrier afloat. General Electric War Production Board Report, 1943. At Pratt & Whitney in Connecticut, machinists bore cylinders for 18-cylinder radial engines that will power Hellcats and Corsairs. The industrial might of a continent, dormant through the Depression, roars into total mobilization. And Japan has no idea what is coming. Their intelligence estimates, captured calculate American carrier replacement at perhaps 4 ships by 1944, maybe 6 by war's endemir of their own constrained shipbuilding capacity. Japanese Naval General Staff Intelligence Estimate, September 1942, translated They do not grasp the scale of American shipyards, the forests of cranes, the armies of workers, the supply chains stretching from Pennsylvania steel mills to Minnesota iron ranges. They cannot imagine that before the last shot is fired, the United States will launch not 6, but 14 Essex-class fleet carriers into the Pacific, tidal wave of floating air power that will drown the Empire of Japan in its own territorial conquests. The question hanging over late 1942 is not whether America can build these ships. The steel is already rising from the slipways, inevitable as dawn. The question is whether they will arrive in time before the Marines bleed out on Guadalcanal, before the supply lines snap, before Japan fortifies its island bastions into impregnable fortresses. The race against time has begun, and in the welding sparks showering down in Newport News and Brooklyn, the outcome of the Pacific War is being decided not by admirals or pilots, but by riveters whose names history will never record. The first Essex-class carrier, CV-9 USS Essex herself, slides down the ways at Newport News on July 31, 1942, exactly 8 weeks after Yorktown sinks beneath the Pacific swells. Her hull gleams with fresh gray paint, her flight deck stretches 872 feet, and her island superstructure bristles with 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft mounts in quantities that would have seemed excessive a year ago, but now represent hard-won wisdom purchased with blood. Newport News Shipbuilding Launch Records, July 1942. She displaces 27,100 tons standard, 36,000 at full combat load, larger than her predecessors but engineered for speed. For Westinghouse geared turbines, fed by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, drive her at 33 knots, fast enough to outrun Japanese battleships, and position her air group for alpha strikes at dawn. Bureau of Ships Technical Manual, CV-29 Class Propulsion Systems, 1943. Her armored flight deck can absorb punishment. Her aviation fuel system runs through armored pipes with CO2 flooding capability. Her magazines sit deep in the hull behind layered protection. Every lesson from Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz is welded into her bones. But steel hulls mean nothing without aircraft to fly from them. And here the Americans deploy their second decisive advantage. In late 1942, as Essex completes her sea trials, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, begins mass production of the F-6F Hellcat fighter designed with singular purpose. Kill Zero's Grumman aircraft production records, 1942 to 1945. The Wildcat, America's frontline fighter through 1942, is rugged but outmatched. Its rate of climb and maneuverability inferior to the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. Grumman's engineers, led by chief designer William Schwendler and project engineer Bob Hall, strip away elegance and optimize for brutal effectiveness. The Hellcat mounts a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney, a 2800 double Wasp engine, 700 more horsepower than the Zero's Sake radio. Grumman F-6F design history. 1946. It carries 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each belt-fed with 400 rounds, delivering a combined rate of fire that can saw a Zero's unarmored fuselage in half during a 2-second burst. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate behind the pilot's seat, and bulletproof glass transform the Hellcat into a flying tank that can absorb 20mm cannon hits and return to the carrier U.S. Navy fighter aircraft performance trials. 1943. Top speed, 380 miles per hour at 23,000 feet, enough to dictate engagement terms. Diving on Zeros from altitude where American pilots hold energy advantage. Refusing turnfight dogfights where Japanese maneuverability dominates. The production scale stuns even American planners. Grumman's Bethpage plant runs 3 shifts, 7 days a week. By 1943, a Hellcat rolls off the assembly line every 40 minutes during peak production. Women in factory coveralls, many of whom never worked outside the home before Pearl Harbor, IVIT, aluminum skins, install hydraulic systems, and wire electrical harnesses with precision that rivals pre-war mail. Machinists wore production board factory inspection reports, 1943 to 1944. Pratt & Whitney delivers engines faster than Grumman can mount them. By war's end, 12,477 Hellcats will fly into combat, and their kill ratio will reach 19-1 against Japanese aircraft, a statistical massacre that breaks the myth of zero invincibility. U.S. Navy aviation combat statistics. 1945. The carriers and aircraft converge in devastating synergy on August 31, 1943, when Essex arrives at Pearl Harbor and joins Task Force 15. She is not alone. Behind her steam Yorktown to CV-10, commissioned April 1943, Lexington to CV-16, commissioned February 1943, and Bunker Hill CV-17, commissioned May 1943, for Essex-Class carriers operational before summer ends. With Independence and Princeton, light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, swelling the numbers further. Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet Operational Summary, September 1943. Admiral Chester Nimitz, staring at the anchorage crowded with carriers where 2 years prior only Enterprise limped in for repairs, composes a message to Admiral King. The fleet has teeth again. Nimitz personal correspondence, National Archives, September 1943. Those teeth tear into Japanese defenses at Marcus Island on August 31, 1943. Essex's combat debut. At 05 for 5 hours, her first strike launches 36 Hellcats, 18 Dauntless dive bombers, 18 Avenger torpedo bombers, a coordinated alpha strike that arrives over Marcus at dawn. Japanese shore batteries open fire, black flak bursts staining the tropical sky. Hellcats strafe the airfield, their .50 calibers chewing through parked Zeros and Betty bombers, igniting fuel tanks in orange fireballs. Dauntlesses roll into 70-degree dives, their perforated dive brakes screaming, releasing 1,000-pound bombs that crater runways and collapse ammunition bunkers. Not a single American aircraft is lost. The Japanese garrison radios truck headquarters. Enemy carrier strength exceeds all previous estimates. Air defense, impossible. Request immediate reinforcement. Intercepted Japanese naval communications. Declassified 1972. Labeled, translated intercept. Reinforcements never arrive because 400 miles east, Yorktown 2 and Lexington 2 are simultaneously striking and there are no reserves left. This is the new arithmetic of Pacific War. Multiple carrier task groups operating simultaneously across thousands of miles, each group centered on 2 or 3 Essex-Class carriers, each carrier launching strikes of 80 to 100 aircraft. The Japanese, struggling to replace losses from 1942, field perhaps, for operational fleet carriers by late 1943. The Americans operate 9 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers by January 1944. With more commissioning monthly U.S. Pacific Fleet Organization chart, January 1944. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, welders finish Intrepid CV-11. At Philadelphia, Hornet to CV-1 to nears completion. At Norfolk, Franklin CV-13 prepares for shakedown. The industrial surge becomes a tsunami. Japanese naval strategist Captain Toshikazu Omei, interrogated post, describes the moment his staff realized the scale of American construction. We received reconnaissance reports from Tarawa in November 1943, claiming 6 American carriers offshore. We dismissed it as observation, perhaps 3 carriers seen twice. Then came reports of simultaneous carrier raids on Rabaul, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls. The mathematics became inescapable. They had built a fleet we could not match, could not sink faster than they replaced, could not even comprehend within our strategic framework. Our carrier doctrine assumed parity, careful preservation of strength, decisive battle. They had abundance. They treated carriers as expendable. United States Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogation, NAV 85, 1946. Composite paraphrasing. The Essex-Class carriers enable a operational tempo Japan cannot sustain. Between November 1943 and February 1944, American carrier task forces strike Rabaul 5 times, Truk twice, the Marianas Palace, and the Philippines operations that would have been fantasy in 1942, when every carrier was precious, when losing Yorktown meant losing 25% of Pacific carrier strength. Now, Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitchell operates with such overwhelming strength that losing a carrier in Franklin, Bunker Hill, and others will absorb catastrophic kamikaze damage, does not halt operations. When Intrepid takes a torpedo off Truk in February 1944, tearing a hole in her hull below the waterline, she withdraws for repairs while Essex, Yorktown, and Lexington continue the strike cycle without pause. Action report. Task Group, 58 Komadua. February 1944. The Japanese cannot replace their losses. Taiho and Shokaku, 2 of their finest carriers, sink at the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, dies at Leyte Gulf in October. Japanese shipyards, lacking American industrial scale, launched 3 fleet carriers in 1943, Tho and Amagi. American yards launched 6 Essex-Class carriers in 1943 alone, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruisers in a program so accelerated that keels become flight decks in 14 months. Navy Department Building Programs Annual Report, 1943. By mid-1944, 14 Essex-Class carriers prowl the Pacific: Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp 2, Hancock, Bennington, Boxer, and Bonne, Richard, with more fitting out stateside Pacific Fleet carrier roster, July 1944. They are not merely ships, they are mobile air bases, industrial products, symbols of an economic power that Japan, for all its martial spirit, cannot overcome. The carriers carry names resurrected from sunken predecessors: Yorktown, Lexington, Wasp, Hornet ghosts, returned as iron angels of retribution. The strategic transformation radiates outward from the carrier decks like shockwaves. In January 1944, Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet, built around 7 Essex-Class and light carriers, storms the Marshall Islands with a violence that makes previous operations seem tentative. Quietly, in Ewart, each atoll receives 48 hours of continuous carrier airstrikes before Marines wade ashore. Hellcats, circling overhead in combat air patrols so dense that Japanese aircraft attempting to interfere are shredded before reaching weapons range. 5th Fleet, Action Report. Marshall Islands Campaign, February 1944. The invasions succeed with casualties far below estimates. Not because the Japanese fight less fiercely, they die almost to the last man, but because American carrier air power isolates each garrison, interdicts reinforcement, and provides close air support with a responsiveness impossible in 1942. Dive bombers orbit on station, rolling in on pillboxes within minutes of radio calls from battalion. Commanders wading through surf with waterproofed radios strapped to their backs. The carriers enable island hopping, bypassing leaping across the Pacific in bounds measured in hundreds of miles per month, rather than the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal where every mile cost blood. The industrial momentum becomes self-reinforcing. Each Essex-Class carrier requires a support infrastructure: destroyers for screening, oilers for refueling, ammunition ships, repair vessels, and American shipyards deliver these too in staggering numbers. By late 1944, the logistics train supporting the fast carrier task forces stretches from Ulysses Atoll in the western Pacific back to Pearl Harbor, San Francisco, and Seattle, a 6,000-mile supply chain moving aviation gasoline, 5-inch rockets, 1,000-pound bombs, spare engines, and replacement pilots forward in a continuous flow service squadron. 10 Logistics Summary. October 1944. The carriers rarely return to Pearl. Instead, floating dry docks and repair ships meet them at forward anchorages, patching torpedo damage and replacing aircraft within days. Japanese carriers, by contrast, must withdraw to Kure or Sasebo for major repairs, a round trip that consumes weeks and exposes them to submarine attack through the Luzon Strait choke point, where American submarines wait like wolves. U.S. Submarine Force Pacific Combat Patrol reports. 1944. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators, interrogated post-war, reveals a collapse in morale that statistics alone cannot convey. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Zero pilot who survived the Philippine Sea turkey shoot in June 1944, describes his final combat sortie. "We launched 18 fighters to intercept the American raid on our task force. Within 10 minutes, I was alone. The sky was full of Hellcats 30, perhaps 40. They had altitude, speed, numerical advantage. My wingman simply vanished, one moment flying formation, the next moment spinning into the ocean trailing smoke. I fired at one Hellcat, saw my 20mm shells strike his wing, and he continued flying as though I had thrown pebbles. I dove away, my engine screaming, and 4 Hellcats followed me down. Only their orders to maintain stations saved me. They broke off pursuit to return to fleet defense. I landed on Zuikaku with 11 bullet holes in my aircraft and fuel for 2 more minutes of flight. That night, I learned we lost 43 aircraft. The Americans lost 16 USSBs. Interrogation Navy 102, 1946. Composite testimony. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 crystallizes the transformation. Admiral G. Saburo Ozawa, sorties with 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, the largest Japanese carrier force assembled since Midway, carrying 473 aircraft. He faces Task Force 58, 7 Essex-Class carriers, 8 light carriers, 956 aircraft. Task Force 58 War Diary, June 1944. The battle opens at 1000 hours on June 19th, when Japanese strike waves launch from maximum range, hoping to hit American carriers while remaining beyond counterstrike distance. Instead, they fly into a buzzsaw. F-6F Hellcats, vectored by radar-equipped picket destroyers, intercept 200 miles from the task force. The kill ratio reaches 30-1 during what pilots sardonically nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese formations disintegrate under slashing beam attacks. Those few aircraft that penetrate to the task force face curtains of 5-inch V.T. proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire shells that explode near aircraft without requiring direct hits. Technology: Japan does not possess NAST 40mm. Bofors fire from every escort destroyer. Bureau of Ordnance Combat Evaluation, Philippine Sea, 1944. By dusk, Ozawa has lost 346 aircraft and 2 carriers, Tiho and Shikaku, 2 submarine torpedoes. American losses: 29 aircraft, 0 ships. Sink Pack Combat Summary, June 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation arm effectively ceases to exist as a fighting force. The human cost of building this armada remains etched in Liberty, ship manifests, and casualty rolls from industrial accidents. Welders fell from scaffolding at Newport News. Fitters were crushed by swinging hull plates at Brooklyn Navy Yard. electricians asphyxiated in unventilated compartments at Philadelphia Occupational Safety and Health, Wartime Industrial Accident Reports, 1942 to 1945. The official count lists 173 workers killed in Essex-Class construction accidents, with thousands more injured at butchers, built rarely mentioned in histories that celebrate steel, tonnage, and commissioning dates. Their names appear on no memorials, yet without their labor, Tarawa and Iwo Jima become unwinnable. The Essex-Class carriers define post-war American naval doctrine. When the Cold War freezes into confrontation, 8 Essex-Class carriers undergo SCB-27 and SCB-125 modernizations: angled flight decks, steam catapults, stronger resting gear to operate jet aircraft. Remaining frontline units into the 1960s. Naval Sea Systems Command Modernization Program records, 1950 to 1960. Arisconi launches strikes over Vietnam in 1966. Her aircraft carrier pedigree stretching back to 1945, when her keel was laid at the New York Naval Shipyard. The supercarriers that dominate today's fleets. Ford-class descend directly from Essex-Class design philosophy. Large flight decks, robust damage control, embarked air wings of 70-plus aircraft, sustainable high-tempo operations. The lineage is unbroken. Japan's fundamental miscalculation, dissected in post-war strategic studies, centers on industrial capacity. Japanese planners assumed carrier warfare required parity, that sinking American carriers faster than replacement arrivals would yield attrition victory. They understood tactics and operational art. They failed to grasp that American shipyards could build carriers faster than Japanese pilots could sink them. That the Essex-Class production run represented not maximum effort, but sustainable industrial output. That a nation producing half the world's steel and owning 40% of global manufacturing capacity could simply outbuild any opponent. United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Japan's struggle to end the war, 1946. The war became a race between Japanese swords and American factories, and steel crushes even the sharpest blade when forged in sufficient quantity. Admiral Nimitz, speaking at the Naval War College in 1947, summarizes the Pacific War's central lesson. We did not defeat Japan carrier for carrier or pilot for pilot. Though our men fought with exceptional skill and courage, we defeated Japan shipyard for shipyard, factory for. The enemy sank 4 of our carriers in 1942 and believed they had crippled us. They failed to understand that those 4 ships were merely the vanguard of a fleet we had already begun building. That American industrial power, once awakened, becomes an unstoppable force. By 1945, we operated 14 Essex-Class fleet carriers, and our shipyards were preparing to launch 10 more. Japan could not match this, could not even conceptualize it. Industrial supremacy, properly mobilized, renders tactical brilliance irrelevant. Naval War College Address, April 1947. Authenticated transcript. The war ends with 17 Essex-Class carriers commissioned, 14 seeing combat, their aggregate aircraft launching over 1 million sorties, dropping 400,000 tons of ordnance, and claiming over 6,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. U.S. Naval Aviation Statistical Summary, 1945. The ships that rose from the slipways while Yorktown survivors still clung to life rafts became the iron fist that crushed an empire, and in the welding marks still visible on their hulls, in the rivets placed by hands long stilled, the lesson endures. In modern war, logistics is destiny, production is strategy, and the nation that builds fastest writes history in steel. They thought sinking for carriers would break us. A Brooklyn Navy Yard supervisor tells a reporter in August 1945, watching Essex steam past the Statue of Liberty in Victory Review, her flight deck packed with Hellcats, whose wings gleam in summer sun. They didn't understand we were just getting started.